was hot today.
It was.
It was like blazing hot, and then, I don't know about your house, but here, about an hour ago, was a definite summertime just downpour.
Yeah, I saw.
I mean, it
over-
got dark, it, you know, it shook the building a little bit. I mean, it was hard rain.
Yeah, when we pulled off the highway, we were like, "Whoa, it definitely rained here," because it was like completely dry until like just
Yeah.
off the
Yeah,
highway.
no, and
The parkway was dry. The off ramp was drenched.
How about that? Yeah, I mean, it rained hard for maybe half an hour.
Just like summertime.
Yeah, man,
Yeah.
it's like summertime.
I saw part of a rainbow on my way.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
man,
we-
it was hitting it.
Andrew and I ran to grab a burger and then came back, and it was, raindrop kind of sprinkling when we pulled in. And we were getting out of the car and gathering all the stuff, and I hear this noise, and I turn, and it's that like wall of water phenomenon that was coming in.
Oh.
And I was like, go, Andrew, go. Shut the door, shut the door.
I wish you'd do that at our house.
Yeah, it didn't even, still sunny and fine when we left, so it didn't even seem like anything had happened.
I was texting with some of our snowbirds, like with Kelly and Lisa and Larry and Susie and Ed and Susan, asking them, like, what's the weather like? I think it was Ed said it was like 50 today.
I have a
Where in
snowbird.
Ohio?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
The
My
ones-
snowbird neighbor that lives in Illinois, she texted me it was 55 and raining.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
All my Michigan coworkers, because like where I work, I work in Michigan,
Mhm.
and they're all complaining about it being cold today and
It's a cold rain.
needing to get an
I
extra.
should
cup
send
of
it
hot- yeah.
here.
And I was like, my phone says the real feel right now is 100 degrees.
Yeah, man, it was hot today. I mean, hot.
Yeah.
We don't do cold here.
Yeah. When I was talking to my family earlier, I asked them how the weather was, and they said, well, it's because they're in Tucson, and they said, well, it's in the 90s, but we're very comfortable. She said, it's a dry heat. And I said,
Everybody
I got
rarely
so mad. I
says
was
that.
like, I don't want to hear anything about dry heat. I'm so sick of people from out west talking about dry heat. She was like, why are you so angry? And I was like, don't worry, it's a dry anger.
You know what else has dry heat? Ovens.
Yeah.
Ovens have a dry
Ovens
heat.
have a dry heat. That's how
Yeah.
they work.
Yeah, but if it's hot enough, it's still hot, right?
Yeah.
Well, we went to Vegas a long time ago, and it was like 107 and 114. We're walking on this trip.
I was so
We were
sick.
like in between hotels, walked halfway there, and she just like, no. And she just turned around and started walking back the other direction. I'm like, what are you doing? We were heading. She's like, yeah, but then we have to do that again to get back. She's like, I'm done. We're
I was
we're
ready
going
to
back
cry.
to the last one.
Like the
Okay.
pavement was burning my feet through my flip flops. It was so hot. Like
Mm.
it was so hot. Like I don't care if it was dry heat or not. I was miserable. I was like, oh my word, this is the worst.
Yeah, get out of here with that dry heat.
Yeah.
Nonsense.
But she just like dead stops in the middle of the road. Nope, and turns around and keeps walking back the other way.
Although, and there is some truth to it, right? Because it can be cold and it's bad, but if it's cold and wet, it's worse.
I agree.
A wetness can make the hotter
No.
hot
The,
and
the
colder
humidity
cold.
definitely makes a difference. It's just more. It's about people who like brag about the weather out where it's nicer than here.
I think the
It's a
big
jealousy
difference,
that
and
makes me angry.
I noticed this when we went to Colorado. The difference is if you get in the shade, the humidity follows you. Obviously, when it's a wet hot, like you,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
can't really
it-
get away from it because the
Right,
humidity's all
shade
around.
actually
The air.
helps,
Yeah, but like if you're in a dry heat and you go underneath shade, like it
cools
feels
off.
great. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, this is amazing. So you can get away from it. But with humidity, it's like, no, I'm here too.
Yeah, I got you.
I remember I went once to Houston, and it was day 9 of a triple-digit stretch, and it was like 106. And I've lived in Florida for a long time, and I'm used to some heat, but like that was where it was like I need to like get out of this or I'm gonna die. Like this, my survival instincts kicked in. I was like, I need to get inside.
Protect myself.
Yeah.
Although it was funny when we were in Colorado, we started at the bottom of the mountains and it was like 90
96.
degrees. It was so hot and so we were in like just shorts and a tank top. By the time we got to like the summit of where we were going, it was like 50 some degrees and we were freezing.
Yeah, I spent
And there
a
was
summer.
snow.
I spent a summer in Kenya, and I was not bright enough to actually ask about the weather. I just thought, I'm going to Africa in the summer. And and I thought, so I packed, well, I was teaching a class, so I had some polos for class and pants, but everything else I took was like shorts and t-shirts. It turns out it was a pretty high altitude and it was pretty chilly. It was like 50 in the morning and 70s during the day. And I'm like, man, I could use a jacket, definitely could use more pants.
This is nothing like Lion King.
Yeah, except that there actually is that valley that stretches out towards Victoria is whenever he goes into the paradise where he finds Pumbaa and Timon, I think that is kind of where that's supposed to be based. But it was chilly.
We were in Haiti for 10 days, and it was hot, and it never stopped being hot.
First time
But-
I went to Puerto Rico was in January of one year. Not this January, but it was in a January, and it was paradise. I'm like, why have I not been here before? What can I do in my life to try and get back here again? Is this heaven?
Yeah.
And so, like a year and a half later, I came back, and it was July, and it was the hottest thing I've ever experienced in my life. Like, my sweat had sweat. It was, and there was no relief from it. Like, and the first time I was there, I don't think I saw a mosquito. This time, I felt like I had to hunt mosquitoes for an hour before I went to sleep to at least give myself a little bit of time before they started to eat me.
Your body really does adjust though. Like by day 5 or 6, it was still hot, but
Yeah.
at least your body had to adjust to it a little
The
bit more.
tarantulas were fighting me.
Ugh.
You try to hit them with the broom, thinking you gotta go, and it backs up on its back legs and swings its front leg at you. I'm like, now you really gotta go.
I will never ever visit Puerto Rico ever. Not with that.
Yeah, that's when animals do that, where they start to fight back, and I'm like, what do you know that I don't know? You're this confident.
Oh, he would have won me instantly because I am terrified of spiders.
Yeah,
I'm
man.
like, nope, you win. It's
I'm
yours.
out. I'm out.
Yeah, you can have the whole room. I'm done.
Oh man, when I went to Africa in Ghana, we were staying at this resort, and they used bug spray, but it was the kind of bug spray where it's there's a bug, you spray it, it's dead. But they would just spray the rooms with that, just
Like
And
Vulgars,
so
yeah.
and it was just, I couldn't breathe,
Thick, yeah.
I couldn't see, I couldn't think. It was just, I had to ask them to stop, and then I realized they knew better than I did about why they needed that many, and the bugs got bad, and I was like, can you spray my room again? I'll breathe later.
I'll breathe later.
Breathing can be optional.
So true, so true. All right, I say let's get started.
Let's do it. Video?
Yep.
Okay.
On the topic of skin pain,
Yeah.
it's
There
Job.
you go. Some guy named John.
Book of Job. It's a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament, describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man. And then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you blessed him with prosperity. Let Job suffer. Then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job, who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by three friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how the section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend, then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now, Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent, and so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now, we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way, and so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, Job, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have a Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just, and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of. Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent, and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind, and he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail, describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours is extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. He starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile, but more likely they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God. And what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now this is surprising, because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling. How Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored. Not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God. And that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God, like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God, and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
Nice. So, where to start? Maybe with your questions. What are your questions about Job? About the book of Job? About the video? Got any?
So how important is that historical context? They pointed out that it's not really very Jewish in its origin, or at least in its literature.
I don't think the historical context has any importance. That's kind of the point. So you have these like made up names in a made up place. And so the story is meant to be in a way timeless. So it doesn't fit, so it's not, it's not a response to some historical event. There's some, the story is trying to tell us something about God more so than something about Job.
It happens in Oz. That's a made up place.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Uz. Ooze.
I always thought it was Satan that, like prompted God to do that, but I guess I didn't get this is on. I always thought it was Satan, and I never knew that was like a word for something else.
Right, yeah, so I mean, our word Satan comes from the Hebrew Hasatan, which just means the Satan, but Satan is a term that meant accuser, like prosecutor. Yeah, I mean, that doesn't kind of fit the other story. Like, not only does it not fit the historical story in any sense, because there's no reference to any place that we know, there's no reference to any time that we know. But even that part of the story doesn't seem to fit. Like it's a different mythology or something. I mean, the Satan character is not one who, in the rest of Scripture, has free access to the throne. Kind of comes in and goes out. This is kind of a unique story in that regard. Yeah.
I've heard a lot of commentary on it over the years that like this may be one of the older, if not the oldest stories that's part of it,
Yeah.
of the Hebrew scriptures. And so, there's some conjecture that the oral tradition of carrying that along may have, modified and or changed the overall a little bit. And that's,
Yeah.
one of the reasons why the
Well-
historical context isn't quite as clear.
Yeah, so one of the reasons they want to make the claim that it's an old story is because there is no reference to Canaan, the promised land. There's no reference to Abraham. There's no reference to the temple or the tabernacle. There's no reference to the Jewish sacrificial system or the Jewish calendar or the Jewish festivals. Like, there's nothing Jewish or Israel or descendant of Abraham about it, which led some to imagine that the story just predates all that, right? It's like Noah or pre-Noah or something really, really ancient. But in that whole literary structure, where it has a prologue and an epilogue, but it's mostly this kind of Hebrew poetry. That kind of Hebrew poetry wasn't written until much later. Like the kind of literature that it is quite late, right? During the time of Hezekiah and the sages, and when poetic books were being written. So I think that the idea that it must be an old story, I think, is probably a little misguided. I think it's more so that this is a late story written in the Hebrew poetic style, and it's kind of decontextualized so as to focus on asking this kind of philosophical question as opposed to kind of telling a story about Abraham, about Isaac, about Moses, about David, about Isaiah.
Kind of like a Bible version of like a fable or like a.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like an allegory, yeah. I think that's how it's, there once was a man named Joe.
Yeah.
Once upon a time.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to learn from his friends, interestingly enough. My dad used to tell me, you can always learn from any situation. Sometimes you learn what to do. Sometimes you learn what not to do. Sometimes you learn that from other people. Like, you think that you see them do something and you're like, oh, that was good. I should act like that. Or you learn from other people, man, I'm not gonna do that. And so the whole positive example, negative example thing. So what's interesting about the Friends is I think they provide us both. Like in the prologue, when he's suffering, it says his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come and sit with him in silence. That's good. Like when things are bad, having a good friend who'll just come and be with you. You know? They don't have to explain anything. They don't have to, fix anything. It's beyond them, but they care so much for you that they're going to be with you kind of no matter what. And so initially, his friends seem ideal. Right? They just come and they sit with him in silence. I'm like, yeah, those are some good friends.
And they had to go and open their mouths.
It got bad. It did get bad. So when in the whole drama of if you believe that God is just and therefore he operates in a particular formula of justice, and then here's Job, well, either I haven't done anything wrong, so either God's not just or he doesn't act justly. And when he said that out loud, his first friend objected. And then that starts the dialogues back and forth, right? So Eliphaz offers him some proverbs. Job responds. And then Bildad does the same and Job responds. And then Zophar does the same and Job responds. And truth be known, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, his friends, don't say anything to Job that's inconsistent with like Proverbs. They're just, I mean, it might be some empty platitudes. Bees work hard, they make honey. If you don't work hard, you won't get the sweet life. That kind of stuff. But it's also a little Benjamin Franklin. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. I mean, at what point do Proverbs, they kind of exist in every culture, right? Confucius is kind of a lot of proverbs. There's a lot of African proverbs. There's a lot of American proverbs. There's Hebrew proverbs. Like, we all get it. Like, good observation on life will lead to lessons that you can learn from.
And it's not unlike the kind of conventional wisdom that, for example, I teach my kids.
Yeah.
Hey, if you do bad, there's consequences. And if you do good, there's rewards. And I want to kind of, I think that there is a sort of wisdom to that. I think my history with this book has been one where either the wrongness of the friends has been kind of underplayed, and we almost kind of read those portions of the book and go, yep, that's right. Or it's been overplayed, where we kind of are dismissive of it. But it is, like Robbie said, it's consistent with like a conventional wisdom that we see elsewhere in Scripture. We see it in the wisdom books. And so, yeah, I think that's pretty remarkable.
It is. And here's the truth of it. Sometimes you can work hard, you can mean well, and you still find yourself in a tough spot. Not every difficulty you face is a result of a mistake you made. Now, you can make mistakes, and that can cause difficulties. That's true. But not every time do you face difficulty is it a simple cause and effect. There's a logical fallacy. The Latin is post hoc ergo propter hoc. It means after this, therefore, because of the A, it's assumed that A is the cause of B, except that's the fallacy. Just because it came earlier doesn't mean it was necessarily the cause of what came later. Because something can happen that it can happen kind of out of its own, there can be other causes, or it can happen out of its own initiative that which came earlier wasn't therefore the cause of it. There's a great episode actually in
The West Wing.
The West Wing that discusses it. Martin Sheen's character is brilliant in that. But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what they're facing here, is that sometimes bad things just happen, and our formulas are faulty at that point, like they don't work. And to try and use them is to actually cause more abuse. Like, Paul would tell Timothy, don't be ashamed, Timothy, when you have to labor, when you have to work in word and doctrine, rightly dividing the word of truth. Well, if it takes work to rightly divide the scriptures, several things I think that is suggested there. One, if you have to rightly divide the scriptures, it's possible to wrongly divide them, right? To get it wrong. And the very fact that Satan quotes scripture to Jesus in the temptation is proof that you can misuse scripture, right? Satan is not using scripture well there when he says, go ahead and jump off, and he's given his angels charge over you, so take the risk, it won't be a problem. That's not a good use of that scripture. So it is possible to wrongly divide it. So I think that's a point, and I think that's what's happening to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. It's that it's not ultimately that what they're saying is in all ways false. It's that it's not applicable to this situation. Like they're misapplying it. They're saying it has to be this way, Job. You must have done something, and that's just not true. It is just not the case. And Job, really makes his point. And then comes, I'd always said Elihu. He said Elihu or something. He put the emphasis on that last syllable. And I put it on the middle one. But anyway, the younger dude who comes along and offers some wisdom. I mean, it's a bit, as they said, it's a bit more nuanced. That's kind of nice. And he's kind of saying, well, maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's not so cause and effect. Maybe, Job, you didn't do something wrong, but maybe God's just trying to warn you, or God's trying to protect you by giving you this so you don't go down that road. But whatever you do, Job, stop saying what you're saying about God.
Wait, don't accuse God, dude.
Right. Don't accuse God, dude. Right. Yeah. I love that. I loved it when I saw it because I thought it was just clever, and I thought the informality of it fit the fact that he seems to be a lot younger, like a much younger generation than Job's older, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar are older, and then you got Elihu who's there, and he's like the college kid who comes in and it's like talking to the senior adult saying, "Hey, dude." So that was funny, I thought. But even then, so about a third of the Psalms, we call them lament Psalms, have a similar tone to that section of Job, where Job is kind of crying out to God, not just crying out for help, but crying out in like complaint, like, "Come on, this hurts. It's too much. It's too much stress. It's too much pressure. If you're good, come on. Let's get the good stuff going." And of course, then God does kind of show up and talks to Job. Literally, one of the best ways to translate it, it says that Job takes his hand and covers his mouth. Trying to keep from saying anything else, maybe. There, at the end there, that kind of prologue, they translated it, and I think it is common. We can actually look that up. It's look it up in a couple of different translations we have. I'm not sure what all translations we have available here in the room, but let me see if I can find the exact verses. Job, I think it's 42:7.
The restoration of Job?
Yeah. So when it says, This is the New American Standard. It came about after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant has. You have not, let's see, maybe this is spoken. And now therefore, you're sent to the. Hold on. I can't seem to find it.
What are you looking for?
There, it's in the Hebrew. It uses a preposition for how the friends speak about God, but the preposition for Job is better translated speaking to God. And it's a simple preposition. Literally, it's just a single letter that's attached to the front of the word. It's prefixed to the word that we almost always translate to, and but yet here in this we often translate it about, because we seem to think that this is a comparison between what they said about God versus what Job said about God. But I think if we went with the more simple translation, the basic translation, then they've said these things about God, but what Job has done that's right is that he's talked to God. And that's what he's being commended for. And then Job is told to pray for his friends in the same way that Job had prayed kind of for himself. But the praying there is talk, in this case again, to God, not talk about God. And I think in times of suffering, that's what we need, right? We don't need philosophies to try and explain why evil things happen. That gets beyond us. But what we can benefit from is some honest, heartfelt talk directly to God. In fact, he spoke rightly. Rightly might not just be correctly, but like rightly, like directly, like talking to you, right? That's how Job did. I was Job there, you were God. I'm talking to you. But that's what's being commended. Because, as they said, if we take it that Job spoke right about me, well, Job, who said a lot of things we know is wrong. And even the videos, like, well, that doesn't make sense because we know Job said things that are wrong. But again, if it's not being commended for what he said, but for the fact that he was saying it to God, not about God, then that solves the dilemma.
That whole conversation, the response from God to Job later on, though, it always felt a little weird. And not to say that God responds wrongly. Like that's not the intent of that statement. But like they even called it out at the beginning of it when they were talking about the throne room scene and the accuser who comes and makes the challenge that I bet if you took everything away from him that he would curse you and all those things. Like they pointed out that was brought up at the beginning and it's kind of left alone for the rest of the book. It doesn't get brought up again. And it seems like, if if he's really going to challenge God and he's really going to take it to him and say, I don't like what's going on here, at some point, God would kind of relent and say, hey, we had this weird sort of heavenly agreement that led to the events that occurred here, but instead he takes a very aggressive posture on in that response on, well, where were you when I built everything that was around? And it seems oddly aggressive to me for the circumstances that led to that point in the first place. Like, I know this is going to sound like a terrible judgment of the book. The beginning of it seems like a drunken bar bet. The end of it seems like the rage response to somebody asking about the drunken bar bet. Like, they don't seem to go together well in a way that puts God in a, you sort of accepted the bet and then got mad when he called you out on it. Like, I don't know. It doesn't read well.
I think that's fair. I mean, I think it's again, because the story is offered to us in such a ahistorical way. It, like Stacy referred to it like almost like a biblical fable. Yeah. Or we could, I mean, another way to think about it, because it's so poetic, literally, it's using poetry. It's like what we have in the Gospels, in the parables, except it's like an extended parable. It's like this really long parable. Really, really long. And as that type of literature works, this ahistorical, fable-ish, parable-ish, it kind of begs that kind of asking. Like, this part doesn't feel right, But I think that's exactly the way these types of stories work in Scripture. Again, not to say that, there's plenty of parts of Scripture that are historical, that are telling us the time, the date, the place. Think of Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. In such and such year of this Caesar, and such year of this governor, and such year of this, on this particular day, this happened, right?
The year King Uzziah died.
Yeah, like you get all of these kind of details.
Yeah.
And I think when they give that to us, we should think, oh, they're wanting us to know where this is in the storyline. But when they don't give that to us, especially when they don't give us any hint, I mean, it's kind of like there was a guy who sowed seeds in a field.
Yeah.
There was a guy who found a pearl, and so he went and he worked and he collected a lot of money and went back and bought the field. Right? It's that kind of feel that it has.
It's not meant to be like pulled apart and thought about like that way. It's just like kind of like this. It's just a big overview of like, this is what the takeaway is. Like during this situation, it's not up to us to question like, is God causing this? Is this causing this? Like not questioning the why, but our response to it.
Yeah.
And how we're supposed to be reacting to it.
Yeah, and even the fact that even if our response is hard,
It's okay.
it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe even better
Yeah. No, I'd say,
than the happy talk of the friends.
yeah, I'd say like Job, and in the latter chapters, is being far more honest with himself and everyone else than he is at the beginning, where he's saying, God gives and God takes away. I think
that's still in the prologue.
right.
We haven't gotten to the poetry yet.
Right. So, I think that speaking rightly to God.
Yeah, I wish I could find that.
So what I found was that when he was referring to what the friend said, the word is dabar, but he says there's another word called dabar aleh, which is to say like you speak words about me instead of just speaking to me. I think that might be what you were looking for.
Yeah, maybe.
In verse 8, I found that.
Might be good.
It's interesting that like the structure of it, like when Elihu or however we want to say it, is talking, and it goes into where God starts to talk to Job. God almost seems to kind of pick up the train of thought that Elihu has there, which is so interesting to me, like, because, I mean, the bar bet that God made was, how is Job going to respond to this, you know? And like the voice of accusation from his friends kind of blends right into what seems to be a voice of accusation from God, right? Like God really gives him the third degree in that. And I've read some stuff that kind of hint that, or make the case that Job's seeming kind of hasty repentance, like there's like just this little tag that's ended onto that very end of the body of the book, where Job seems to kind of, oh, I'm sorry, I take it back. Some people think that that might have been a later addition to it, that like in maybe a older version of the story, Job kind of stood his ground and like, you know, didn't, you know, kind of capitulate even to God. And it's interesting to me that it says that even that kind of, like even when the conclusions we arrive about God are not correct, that honesty that in times like that, where we can kind of bear it out and lay it out and even kind of give it back to God, like God can take that. He doesn't shy away from that. That is still speaking rightly.
I
Yeah.
like that wrestling with God, like when you're wrestling,
Yeah.
with, like it's okay, and actually it's probably encouraged, because doing that wrestling is probably when you're, in the end, it's gonna put you closer to God, because you're gonna have a better understanding of it, or like you said, it's going to allow you to have that trust, just to say, it's yours. Like,
Yeah, like Abraham wrestles with God, right? In the, what should happen to Sodom. Jacob wrestles with God. Moses goes back and forth with God. Like all of these characters, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Like all of these characters they're not just robots responding to a programming. They are people who are engaging a living God. And I mean, growing up in the Pentecostal church that I grew up in, I feel like I was taught that a lot. Like we were taught, we called it tarrying in prayer. We were taught that when you prayed, it wasn't automatic. It wasn't like stick it in the microwave and it's going to pop out done. That you would labor in word and truth. You would tarry in prayer. You would, quote unquote, hold on to the horns of the altar. Man, we used a lot of Christianese language. But I think what that language was pointing to was that sometimes this was struggle, and the struggle was often, I was the problem in the struggle, not the help of the struggle. But still, it was encouraged. We told testimonies, and we talked about the testimonies we told. And preachers would say, like, if you don't have a testimony, it's probably because you're not living right. Because when you're living right, things are going to go wrong. And when things go wrong, you're going to be tested to see how you respond. And when you're tested, when you see how you respond, then you'll have a testimony. Because you can't have a testimony without a test. Anyway, they get all.
That's an interesting. That's
Very
like
deep
that's a total inversion of, like, that's like saying, hey, if things are bad, you're doing something right. Like that's the exact opposite of the conventional.
Of the
wisdom
conventional,
that-
no. Like if you're living for the Lord, the devil's going to come after you, right? It's not a bed of roses.
Yeah.
Jesus said, "Take up your cross," and it would start slow and it would get louder
Yeah.
and faster. That was the rhythm of the sermons.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then you have the opposite too, because you have churches who are like, well, if you have cancer, it's because you're not talking to
You got
God
some
right.
sin in there
Yeah.
somewhere that's
Yeah,
not
you
Yeah.
gotta
Like
find
that.
it and dig it out.
Or if your kid's sick, it's your fault. There's sin in your life because your kid's sick.
We were as adults, we went to a church one time that said that. Like, we almost got up and walked out because it was so wrong. Like, literally, he said, if you have cancer, there's more than likely sin in your life you haven't dealt with, and that's why you're not getting better.
Yeah,
It's
we were in a church that said
That was like nasty.
something similar to that, and then if you repent, it'll go away, or you know, all you need is faith and you won't hurt anymore. And Angela's mom, who was the best human we've ever known, had just died of cancer. And the minister was up on like a platform, and he came out behind the pulpit to come down and pray for people. But in order to do so, somebody had to come bring him his cane because he had hurt his knee. And
He's got sin in his life.
no, the irony wasn't lost on me
Oh my
that
goodness.
if you're hurting, there's sin in your life, and if it's not reconcilable, it's because you don't have faith. And then he's kind of hobbling down.
So I guess when everybody dies, that was when they've got a sin they can't deal with. That's
Yeah.
just the end of our life.
But in his case, it was just he was
Everybody
being
dies.
tested because he's living right.
I don't know, man. It was
Because I mean, that's
And
just kind of like.
actually, it was within the next Sunday or two that we came to Oasis, and we've been here ever since.
Same with us.
Well, thank goodness for that sermon then, right?
Yeah, we stumbled on Oasis shortly after that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of like, the whole, like, I guess people call it the name and claim it, the ones that are complete opposite, whereas like when we say it, it's going to happen no matter what.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
God's
Yeah.
holding on to those blessings, but he can't give them to you unless you say it this way.
or you're just going to keep
Right.
telling them and keep telling them and keep telling
Yeah.
them, like,
Or if you say it just right, God won't be able to resist.
yeah.
Right. Then you kind of got God. It's like you caught him in something.
It's
Like,
the Hebrew
okay, now you
magic
got to give
word.
it to me.
Yeah.
As if, yeah. I heard a very good sermon on that once. He said, kind of speaking about how that's problematic. He's like, look, God's not your butler, and God's just not going to, he's not like a well-trained dog, right? Sit, God sit. Speak, God speak.
Yeah.
Heal, God heal.
That's worse.
Which
It's
is
like
funny because it's the double meaning. For the
Oh,
dog
yeah.
to heal means to sit still.
Yeah. Yoga, heal. I think it's easy and good to vilify those kinds of sermons. They are obviously terrible. I heard a preacher once in my youth, and I'm trying to place the time and place of it, but I remember that they had a whole kind of taxonomy of ailments and what sins correspond to them. Like if you have this, then this is the kind of sin you have in your life. If you have this, if it's this kind of cancer, it's because of unforgiveness, that kind of stuff. And I think it's good to pan those. But it is also and it's the logical conclusion of a kind of worldview that is kind of fatalistic and deterministic of all things. That God, it's the only conclusion you can arrive to if you think that everything that happens to all people everywhere at all times is dealt by God. That if something good happens to you, it's because God did something good to you, and if something bad happens to you, it's because God did something bad to you.
See, I always took that as the opposite, that we want so much control over everything in our life that we're trying to find something about ourselves that can fix it, rather than letting God fix it. So I always thought it was, I want this outcome, so I gotta do this, and that's less God and more.
Yeah.
So I guess it's either or both.
Well, I think that hits the nail on the head. I think it speaks more to our ideas of control and power and what God should be than it does about any real understanding of who God is. I think it speaks more to God is all powerful, which means God controls everything, because that's our idea of power. Power is control. And so if God is all powerful, God is all controlling. Except that that's not God's character. That's not who God is.
So like, people that say, with the tragedies in the world, and we just say for cancer, earthquakes, and whatever
Yeah.
that goes bad in the world, question God and say, how could God let that happen? So is that kind of like this thing?
Yeah, it's part of it, and I think part of what Job would say, and other parts of the tradition that we're part of, would say that God's not done moving, right? That God, there's still responses for God to do. Phil preached, I don't know if, did you know Phil? Were you here then? So Phil preached a beautiful sermon, I mean, lots of beautiful sermons, but, I forget what time of year it was, but it was titled, "The King Has the Last Move."
Oh, it was Easter.
It was Easter?
You gotta-
We had the chess piece.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that-
yeah. The king has the last move. And in chess, right, the game's not over until the king can't move. And the last move, and we did, we handed out everybody a chess piece of the king to take with them to remind them of the sermon. But his point was that there is another move that God has, and that's the resurrection,
Yeah.
right? There is something on the other end that will be God redeeming all this. Now, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how it works. The calculus is beyond my skill set, but our hope, our trust is in that, a new life.
What do you say to someone that says that? And like, I got a neighbor and he's
I
always
would-
saying things like
I
that.
would say, man, that's a great question.
You
You know,
said one time though, it changed my perspective, and I think I'm completely remembering it wrong. Something about just making sure that you understand that God's not in the evil. Like,
yeah, I don't think God uses evil.
yeah,
I don't think God is evil. I mean, even that, like, I don't think God uses evil. I think God responds to evil by judging it. God even allows evil to happen to God, right? The crucifixion's evil, right? And so I think what I was hearing Mikkel say earlier, God is sovereign in a unique way that only God is. And it's not control in the same way we would think about control. Because our power is power that's used to coerce and manipulate. God's power is a different kind of power that can accomplish God's will without coercion and without manipulation. It's a slow process, which can aggravate us sometimes. But it's who God has revealed to be, right?
But God doesn't actually cause all these things.
Oh, heavens no.
And so,
In fact, God is willing to take those things on
Yeah.
himself, right? Again, like the crucifixion, right? God is willing to suffer and die, but God's not willing for that to be the end of the story,
Yeah.
which is Easter, right? Resurrection.
Which then goes into the wisdom of God's rhetorical questioning of Job, where he kind of, makes these grand gestures toward the complexity of the world. How all of these, how all of this to say how limited our perspective is. It's like we're like flies that are on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and it's this beautiful thing, but we're this close to it, and it just looks like a gray spot, And what beauty is there? This is terrible. I'm suffering. This is bad, and it's not until I think that final move of the king where everything is kind of revealed and resurrected and healed that we get to see kind of the whole thing.
I think it's good.
I like the second part of the Job where he gets all that stuff back as being like an allegory to the resurrection, just because
I think so, yeah.
I never like that, oh, all your kids died, I'll give you more and it's okay.
Yeah, you got new kids.
Yeah.
Don't you like your new
So,
kids?
but the idea
Yeah.
that,
Good job. You got more. You got more than you
But
had.
to
It's
that
good.
point, it's interesting, like, all of the stuff that he had, he ends up getting twice as much.
Yeah.
Twice as much land, twice as much camels, twice as much sheep, twice as much money. But he ends up with the same number of kids. He doesn't end up with twice as many
so
kids.
it's a resurrection and they're with him.
Yeah.
The same number. Like, you can't, but to your point.
Sure,
you can't
Job's
replace
wife
your
was
kids.
rolling her eyes.
Exactly,
Right,
it
right.
certainly would never take that
Yeah.
thing away, it's not.
Yeah. I don't even feel like I can replace my dog, We got a new dog, but I still miss my old dog. And I love my new dog, but the new dog's not a replacement for the old dog. And if I feel that about my dog, how much more do I feel that about my kids?
Yeah.
I think the biggest example of like going back to like the whole power and control and God
Yeah.
doesn't use that is that fact that like when someone has power and control over you, they're going to make you do what? they want you to do what in any means possible, what
Yeah,
they're,
exactly.
and obviously God doesn't do that because he allows us to come to him and he
Mhm.
waits for us. Like, he allows us to make our mistakes and come to him and see him. Like, he doesn't ever beat us over our head or accuse us or tell, you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
so if he was really that powerful and controlling, like, he wouldn't allow us to come to him. He would force us to come to him.
Yeah,
It'd be easier.
Yeah.
it'd be a different God.
Yeah, like, so you can't, I mean, it's just, there's no way you can.
It's good. It's all very good.
So what do you do with the whole God is, like, in control of everything? You just
Well,
say-
yeah, I resist that kind of
yeah.
verbiage. Like, even, I was trying to say this on Sunday, I don't know if I got it out or not. But when we were taught to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, suggests that there are ways in which God's will is not yet being realized. That's why we're being told to pray for it. We're praying for a future kingdom, for a future reality, for a future paradise to come, but we're not there yet. And so we're still in that time of God's patience, which again, we probably should be more grateful for than what we are. Like, we want God to go ahead and fix stuff, but when we mean fix stuff, we don't mean fix stuff in here with the evils we do. We mean fix stuff out there, right, with the evil somebody else does. But thank God, God is patient so that we don't get crushed in the moment. But yeah, I mean, even Jesus will say, it's time for us to depart, for the ruler of this age is coming. Well, if he's leaving and he's saying the ruler of this age is coming, who's the ruler of this age? It's not him, because he's the ruler of the next age, the age that's coming. And the ruler of this age, I think, would be Satan, and that's why this age sucks. And that's why we need the new age to come, which is what we've then been taught to pray for. And then I think not just pray for, but then also work for, right? Like, it becomes our prayers, but then it also becomes our actions. As we start to act like Christ, he starts to use what we do in the realization of the coming of that kingdom. And so we get to experience parts of it now, of what is coming. So when we're graceful, when we're merciful, when we're forgiving, when we stand up for justice, when we love, when we sacrificially give, like people start to experience the Jesus way of life. And again, I think that's something we can live into now, because, just to quote myself again, I guess, I think this Christian story is our death is behind us and our life is in front of us. I've been saying that a lot lately.
Yeah.
I guess I like the sound of it.
You talking about quoting yourself reminded me of a story. Chris Green was reading something that someone had written and quoted it, and then the person who he had quoted contacted him and said, "Actually, I was quoting you when you had said that originally." So it was, he didn't know, kind of by
Where he got it.
association, he was quoting himself. He's like, "Oh, that's really good. I'm going to use that." What was your idea? You said it.
Well, at least I'm not that bad. Thank you.
I think that
All due respect to our friends.
another takeaway I think we can maybe glean from this is this idea of accusation. You know, we're introduced to this character, the accuser, and I think that we are kind of given a choice often in how we're going to, like, what posture are we going to adopt in the world, especially as it relates to suffering. Are we going to be ones who accuse, or are we going to be ones who advocate? You know, we're told that Satan is the accuser, and we're told that the Spirit is the advocate. And like, I think that those are kind of often two impulses, especially when we see things going badly. Like, we're drawn to one of those two impulses, and I think that it's the work of the Spirit, it's the work of the church, it's the work of the followers of Christ to kind of resist the urge to scapegoat and to blame and to, accuse, and to lean into the impulse to advocate. You know, I think it was Fred Rogers who kind of, I can't remember the quote, but he talks about looking for the helpers. You know, when things are going bad, when, you know, when there's dark days of history, he told a kid, you know, look for the helpers. Look for the ones who are serving and giving and pouring themselves out. Because accusation is cheap. Like, it's easy to do. It's easy to point fingers. And the church does a lot of it, unfortunately. But,
Yeah, it's good.
yeah.
It's very good. All right, friends. Thank you.
Bye, live streamers.